The photograph is ordinary at first glance, a sepia-toned street scene catalogued by the British Library as Florence around late 14th century, civic reconstruction period. Stone buildings stand intact, windows are open, shadows are sharp. But there are no people, no carts, no animals, no market debris, no evidence of flight or disaster, only absence. The catalogue note explains it away, likely staged or captured during early morning hours. Yet the accompanying census fragment, dated 1357, preserved in a Florentine tax register, lists nearly identical household counts to records from before the Black Death, despite claiming over half the population had vanished just years earlier. The street looks lived in. The numbers say it should be empty. The manuscript that once tried the contradiction no longer exists except in fragments quoted elsewhere. And that raises a quiet question. What if the catastrophe we were taught wasn't a collapse, but a reset? By the mid-14th century, Europe is said to be shattered. Between 1347 and 1351, the Black Death allegedly kills 30 to 60% of the population. Textbooks describe abandoned villages, labor shortages that remake feudalism, and social collapse on a scale not seen since the fall of Rome. The narrative is consistent, taught in every classroom, supported by what appears to be overwhelming documentary evidence. Archival anchors support this on the surface. Florentine chronicler Giovanni Boccaccio writes of empty homes and streets filled with corpses. Parish death rolls spike across England and France. Mass graves appear in London, documented in excavation records from Smithfield. Papal correspondence from Avignon speaks of entire monasteries gone silent. The evidence seems conclusive. And yet, municipal documents dated just years later, particularly tax assessments from Florence between 1355 and 1358, show urban continuity that defies the narrative. Street maintenance budgets persist without reduction. Guild dues remain stable, with no accounting for vanished members. Property transfers are recorded with bureaucratic precision, showing no unusual vacancy rates. One marginal note in a 1358 property register reads, "House intact. Occupant reassigned." Reassigned from where? The question sits quietly in the archive unanswered. If 30 million people died, if half of civilization vanished in 4 years, why does the bureaucracy behave as if, it barely noticed? Tax collectors do not maintain collection rates in ghost towns. Guilds do not collect dues from the dead. Maintenance budgets do not survive when there is no one left to maintain the infrastructure. The conventional explanation points to resilience, to the strength of medieval institutions, to the capacity of survivors to rebuild. But resilience implies struggle, transition, visible adaptation. These records show none of that. They show continuation, as if nothing had changed. In Siena, construction logs from the cathedral show uninterrupted quarry deliveries throughout the supposed plague years and immediately after. In Venice, naval rosters remain full, with no gap in the manning of galleys. In Paris, royal building projects continue on schedule. Numbers mourn, the streets do not. The so-called 1357 manuscript survives only through secondary references, quoted in later Vatican inventories and briefly summarized in a 17th century catalogue before disappearing entirely from the historical record. No complete copy exists, no fragments have been recovered. What remains are citations, references in other documents, brief mentions that suggest something important was lost. It was reportedly a comparative register, census tallies aligned with land usage maps and mortality figures across regions of Italy, France, and the Holy Roman Empire. The kind of document that bureaucrats create when they need to understand scale, to compare one region against another to see patterns that individual records might miss. This comparative evidence would have changed how historians read continuity and disruption. A single surviving quotation preserved in a Padua University index from 1623 reads, "The loss is recorded, yet the dwellings remain occupied." The official history claims the manuscript was destroyed for redundancy or irrelevance, that it duplicated information available in other sources, that it simply was not worth preserving. But the pattern of its disappearance suggests otherwise. Documents deemed redundant are typically copied first, archived in multiple locations, referenced extensively before being discarded. Irrelevant manuscripts gather dust, they do not vanish completely. The 1357 manuscript appears in 3 separate inventories between 1401 and 1649, then disappears from all subsequent records. No explanation is given, no copy was made. For a document that supposedly contained routine census data, this is unusual. Census records are among the most frequently copied documents in medieval archives. They have administrative value, tax implications, and legal significance. What kind of census reconciliation would be too dangerous to preserve? The Padua entry offers a hint. It states that the loss is recorded, suggesting the manuscript acknowledged the plague deaths and documented the catastrophe in some form. It also notes that the dwellings remain occupied, suggesting the manuscript recorded something contradictory, something that made the death toll seem incompatible with observable reality. Redundant documents are copied, dangerous ones vanish. The question becomes, what pattern did this manuscript reveal that made its continued existence unacceptable? A census collapse should produce visible chaos. When half a population disappears, the effects cascade through every system. Tax revenue should plummet, there are fewer people to tax, and less economic activity to generate revenue. Infrastructure should decay, roads go unmaintained, bridges collapse, aqueducts fail. Civic works should halt entirely as the administrative capacity to organize them evaporates, along with the workers needed to execute them. The documentary record should show crisis management, emergency measures, desperate attempts to maintain basic services with drastically reduced resources. We should see budget cuts, project cancellations, administrative consolidation, the visible strain of institutions trying to function at half capacity. Yet, construction logs from Siena Cathedral dated throughout the 1350s and into the 1360s show uninterrupted quarry deliveries. The same quantities of stone arrive on the same schedules as before the plague. The same workforce estimates appear in the margin notes. No mention of labor shortages, no adjustment to timelines, no evidence that anything had changed. Florence continues funding aqueduct repairs through the period, with expenditure records showing consistent annual outlays. The maintenance work does not decrease. If anything, it becomes more systematic, more organized, as if administrative capacity had improved rather than collapsed. Venice maintains full naval rosters throughout the 1350s. Galleys require crews of specific sizes. You cannot run a galley with half a crew. The rosters show full complements, ship after ship, through years when the plague is supposed to have killed half the city's population. Where did the sailors come from? The official explanation is institutional inertia, that medieval bureaucracies were so rigid and formulaic that they continued operating by rote even when circumstances had changed dramatically. But inertia does not hire workers who do not exist. Inertia does not quarry stone that no one can transport. Inertia does not crew ships when the sailors are dead. Institutions behave like populations are still there, perhaps because they were. Photographic technology does not exist in 1357, but visual records do. Illuminated manuscripts from the decades following the Black Death depict cities in careful detail, architecture rendered with precision, streets shown in proper perspective. urban spaces that reveal how people understood their physical environment. What is striking is what these images show. Cities appear intact but sparsely populated, with figures that seem oddly generic, almost symbolic rather than representative of actual people. Buildings dominate the compositions. Human figures, when they appear, are small, interchangeable, more like architectural details than portraits of inhabitants. One illuminated chronicle from 1370s, Florence shows the city's streets in meticulous detail, every building, every window, every doorway carefully rendered. But the human figures are sparse, scattered, disconnected from the architecture they supposedly inhabit. The visual weight falls on the buildings themselves, standing ready, waiting. At the same time, foundling hospital records begin to surge. Florence's Ospedale degli Innocenti, founded in 1419, was preceded by earlier charitable institutions that handled foundlings through the late 14th century. Foundlings appear with increasing frequency in the records, a visible trace of demographic rupture and administrative response. The records from these institutions, fragmentary but consistent, show thousands of children admitted with no parental attribution. An intake note from 1363 reads, "Origin unknown. Baptized upon arrival, not orphaned." That would imply known parents who died unknown. As if the children had appeared without history, without lineage, without any connection to the families who supposedly perished in the plague. The conventional interpretation is straightforward. The plague created orphans, devastating families so completely that survivors did not know who these children belonged to. But that does not explain the scale. A crisis that kills parents but leaves children unharmed operates selectively in ways that bubonic plague does not. It also does not explain the pattern of the intake notes. The entry "origin unknown" appears again and again, not as an occasional notation, but as the standard entry. These are not children whose parents are known to have died. These are children who appear with no connection to any family at all. An orphan crisis implies adults died. But where are their homes? Where is the property inheritance, the contested estates, the legal battles over abandoned wealth that should accompany mass orphaning? Children appear where parents did not vanish properly. Modern historians estimate Florence's population dropped from approximately 100,000 to around 50,000 after the plague years. Yet by 1375, less than 25 years after the plague's peak, tax registers list household densities approaching pre-plague levels. The city has recovered, not just survived, but fully repopulated in a single generation. No immigration waves are documented. Florence does not show the kind of population influx that would be necessary to replace 50,000 people. There are no records of rural migrants flooding the city, no documentation of foreign settlers, no evidence of the massive demographic movement that would be required. The rural areas supposedly providing these migrants are themselves recovering from the same plague, dealing with their own population collapse. Where would the surplus population come from? Repopulation happens too quickly and too evenly. The pattern is not concentrated in certain neighborhoods or certain social classes. It is distributed uniformly across the city, as if the population had been systematically restored rather than organically regrown. Natural population recovery follows predictable patterns. Birth rates increase, but the effect takes time, a generation minimum. Migration shows geographic biases, with certain regions sending more people than others. Economic opportunity drives clustering, with newcomers concentrating in specific industries or neighborhoods. None of these patterns appear in the Florentine records. The repopulation is demographically smooth, socially balanced, geographically even, as if someone had simply refilled the city to its proper density. The official explanation suggests we are misreading the records, that the initial population decline was overestimated, or that recovery mechanisms we do not fully understand were at work. Perhaps the plague was not as devastating as chroniclers claimed. Perhaps migration was more significant than documented. Perhaps economic recovery drove population growth faster than we think possible. But the numbers remain stubborn. 50,000 people do not appear in 20 years through natural processes alone, not when the surrounding regions face the same demographic crisis, not when no one documents where they came from. Populations recover, they do not synchronize. Yet the synchronization is what the evidence shows, a city returning to its proper density, as if following a plan, as if someone knew exactly what the population should be and restored it to that level. Post-plague Europe allegedly lacked skilled labor. The Black Death is said to have killed indiscriminately, taking masters and apprentices alike, breaking the chains of knowledge transmission that allowed complex trades to continue across generations. Stonemasons, glaziers, engineers, and architects, all supposedly decimated. Yet, the architectural record shows no such break. The Duomo di Firenze Dome project, conceptually developed by Filippo Brunelleschi in the early 15th century, presupposes continuous engineering knowledge from before the plague, the mathematics required, the structural understanding, the practical mastery of materials. These do not emerge spontaneously. They require unbroken transmission of specialized knowledge. Across Europe, Gothic structures continued rising through the plague, years and after, with no generational interruption. Notre Dame de Paris, Cologne Cathedral, Milan Cathedral, all showing continuous construction that would be impossible without maintained craft knowledge. The engineering does not reset, the techniques do not regress. Institutional memory that allows massive stone structures to rise safely persists without visible disruption. Stone-cutting traditions are particularly revealing. The precision required to shape stones for Gothic vaults, the angle calculations, the load-bearing assessments, these are skills that take lifetimes to master and require continuous practice to maintain. A generation-long break in construction would mean starting over, relearning techniques, rediscovering solutions through trial and error. But the architecture shows no learning curve. Buildings begun before the plague are completed after, with the same level of technical sophistication. New projects demonstrate the same mastery. There is no evidence of knowledge loss, no regression to simpler forms, no period of relearning. The traditional explanation is that enough masters survived to maintain the traditions, that the guilds protected their knowledge, that institutional structures preserved what individual mortality would have destroyed. But guilds are made of people, institutions are made of people. If half the people vanish, how do the institutions remain intact? Perhaps they remain intact because the knowledge was never in danger of being lost. Perhaps the masters who trained the next generation were always there, regardless of what the plague records claim. You do not rebuild mastery from ashes in silence. You do not resurrect engineering traditions through institutional memory alone. Skills survived, something people did not. Or skills survived because people did, regardless of what the mortality records claim. France shows the same pattern. Tax records from Burgundy in the 1360s list household counts that suggest rapid recovery from catastrophic loss. Urban infrastructure continues without the expected breakdown. Orphan intake surges across multiple dioceses with the same notation, origin unknown, appearing in church records. Italy is not alone. Germany shows it too. The Holy Roman Empire administrative records from the 1360s demonstrate the same bureaucratic continuity, the same assumption of stable populations, the same infrastructure maintenance that should not be possible with halved populations. These are not connected regions sharing administrative systems or coordinating responses. These are separate political entities with different languages, different institutions, different record-keeping traditions. Yet the pattern is identical: claimed population loss, observed infrastructure continuity, unexplained demographic recovery, orphan saturation. The same decades, the same administrative calm. In Paris, royal building accounts show uninterrupted expenditures through the plague years. In Prague, Charles IV restructures imperial administration in ways that assume robust institutional capacity. In London, guild records continue with formulaic precision. Independent collapse should look messy. Each region should respond differently based on local conditions, resources, governance structures. Some areas should recover faster, others slower. Some should adapt one way, others differently. Instead, the response is synchronized across thousands of miles. The timeline matches, the administrative behavior matches, the orphan crisis matches, the architectural continuity matches. It is as if the same event happened everywhere, not a chaotic plague spreading organically through trade routes, but something more coordinated, more systematic, more intentional. The conventional explanation is that we are seeing convergent responses to similar crises, that medieval institutions across Europe simply responded the same way because they faced the same challenges. But institutional isomorphism does not explain identical timelines. It does not explain the precision of the synchronization. Chaos spreads organically with variation and delay. Order requires coordination. The pattern across Europe in the mid-14th century suggests order. What kind of event creates identical administrative responses across non-communicating political systems? What kind of crisis produces synchronized recovery timelines in regions with no mechanism for coordination? Chaos does not repeat neatly, but the European recovery from the Black Death does. What if Europe wasn't rebuilt but re-inhabited? The hypothesis emerges quietly from the accumulated evidence. Cities standing ready, infrastructure intact, institutions functioning, but populations mysteriously restored, not through documented migration, not through natural recovery, through something else. Children without lineage, cities awaiting occupants, institutions prepared to receive them. The orphan records become central, thousands of children appearing across Europe in the decades after the plague, all with the same notation: origin unknown. Not orphaned through documented family tragedy, not abandoned by identifiable parents, unknown, as if they had no prior existence within the historical record. Baptismal records from this period show unusual patterns. The Church requires lineage for baptism, some connection to Christian parentage, some claim to membership in the faith community. Yet the records from the 1360s and the 1370s show mass baptisms of children with no parental attribution, no godparents listed, no family connections documented. These children are welcomed into the faith as if their appearance required no explanation beyond the fact of their existence. They are given Christian names, enrolled in parishes, assigned to households. They become citizens, guild members, landholders. Their lack of documented origin does not impede their full integration into society, as if society were expecting them. The cities make more sense in this context. Infrastructure that should not exist with halved populations exists because the populations were never truly halved, or were halved and then restored through mechanisms outside the documented historical record. The buildings stood ready because they were meant to receive new inhabitants, not shelter survivors. This would explain the administrative continuity. Record keeping does not break down because the institutions are not struggling with collapse, they are managing transition. The bureaucrats are not desperately trying to maintain systems with inadequate resources, they are processing the arrival and integration of new populations. It would explain the synchronized timeline. If repopulation were planned rather than organic, If it followed some coordinating logic rather than emerging from individual decisions, then the similarity across regions makes sense. History assumes continuity, that the people living in a place are descended from the people who lived there before, that populations persist through time with gradual change but fundamental connection to the past. The records suggest transfer, that populations were replaced, that continuity is institutional rather than genealogical, that we inhabit cities built for people who came before us but are not necessarily descended from them. Who inherits a civilization? The year 1357 marks several significant events. The Golden Bull of Charles IV, issued by the Holy Roman Emperor, fundamentally restructures imperial authority and electoral procedures. It is a constitutional document creating new administrative frameworks and legal structures that will persist for centuries. It also coincides precisely with the census normalization visible in Italian records, the moment when population figures begin returning to pre-plague levels without documented explanation. And it marks the last confirmed reference to the comparative register, the manuscript that attempted to reconcile mortality claims with observed demographic continuity. Census normalization stands out in the record. The timing is suggestive. Political restructuring, administrative reset, demographic stabilization, and the disappearance of contradictory documentation all occur within the same narrow window. Administrative reset frames the sequence. Charles IV's reforms are not presented as emergency measures responding to plague devastation. They are presented as orderly improvements to imperial governance, systematic reorganization that assumes stable institutions and reliable populations. The language of the Golden Bull does not reflect crisis, it reflects planning. This is the language of people who know what the population is, who understand the administrative capacity they have available, who are establishing structures meant to last. It is the language of confidence, not desperation. Across Europe, the late 1350s and the early 1360s see similar administrative reforms, not reactive scrambling, but systematic reorganization. Tax structures are revised, guild regulations are updated, urban governance is formalized. These are not the actions of societies barely surviving catastrophe. These are the actions of societies establishing new foundations. The census records that show normalization do not gradually increase from collapse levels. They stabilize suddenly, plateauing at densities that match pre-plague figures almost exactly. The curve is not organic recovery, it is administrative reset. What if the Golden Bull and similar reforms were not responding to plague aftermath but coordinating something else? What if 1357 matters not as a moment of recovery, but as a moment of reorganization, when new populations were integrated and new administrative structures were established to govern them? Reorganization is the alternative framing. Paperwork precedes reality in bureaucratic systems. The census does not record populations, it creates them, defines them, gives them legal existence. Property records do not document ownership, they constitute it, making ownership real through documentation. In that sense, paperwork creates reality. If the administrative reset came first, the demographic reality could follow. Authority reorganizes before memory does. Authority moves ahead of immediate recollection. The question is, whose authority and reorganizing what? Whose authority is the key question. The 1357 manuscript allegedly aligned multiple data streams that should not have been compatible. Mortality claims from chroniclers and death rolls, census continuity from tax registers, orphan intake from church records, urban occupation from property transfers. The manuscript attempted a difficult synthesis. Each data type tells a different story in isolation. Death rolls suggest catastrophe, tax registers suggest continuity, orphan records suggest demographic disruption of a specific kind. Property records suggest stable occupation, these are apparent contradictions. The manuscript's achievement, based on the fragmentary descriptions that survive, was showing these data streams simultaneously, not as contradictions that needed to be resolved, but as patterns that revealed something when viewed together. Patterns emerge from the combination. The loss is recorded, yet the dwellings remain occupied. The manuscript did not accuse anyone of falsification. It did not claim the plague was a lie or that the mortality records were fabricated. It acknowledged the loss. The deaths were real, documented, mourned. Loss is recorded alongside continued occupation, but it also showed that something else was happening alongside those deaths, something that made the net effect different from what the mortality records alone suggested. Alongside those deaths, administrative and demographic processes produced a different outcome. The dwellings remained occupied, not because the original inhabitants survived, but because they were occupied by others, by children without origins, by populations that appeared in census records without a documented source. The manuscript revealed pattern rather than contradiction. It showed that multiple incompatible things could be true at the same time if the underlying model of events was wrong. Pattern is more dangerous than accusation. Accusations can be denied, refuted, dismissed as conspiracy or misunderstanding. Patterns simply exist. They do not argue, they show. When patterns appear in official records, when the documentation that is meant to support the official narrative instead reveals something else. The solution is not to refute the pattern, it is to remove the documentation that makes the pattern visible. The 1357 manuscript made a pattern visible. It showed that mortality and continuity, loss and occupation, catastrophe and stability were not contradictions requiring explanation, but data points that revealed a different story when aligned. What kind of story requires the destruction of the evidence that would make it visible? What vanishes when patterns appear? The evidence that creates the pattern. The manuscript is gone. But the data streams it aligned still exist, scattered across archives throughout Europe, waiting for someone else to bring them together. If repopulation occurred through mechanisms outside documented migration and natural increase, lineage fractures followed. The genealogies that connect us to medieval Europe become uncertain in ways that undermine fundamental assumptions about identity and inheritance. Parish records from the late 14th century show unusual patterns in surname adoption. Surnames become more common and more standardized, spreading through populations that previously used patronymics or location-based identifiers. It is as if populations suddenly needed surnames, needed ways to establish legal identity within bureaucratic systems. Surnames spread rapidly and with purpose. The church baptismal records that integrate children of unknown origin also establish them as Christians with full standing in the community. Baptism overwrites whatever came before. These children have no pagan past and no documented existence outside the Christian framework. They simply appear as Christians, ready to be integrated into parishes, guilds, and families. Baptism creates legal belonging. Adoption practices change during this period. Children without documented parentage are assigned to households through mechanisms that are not clearly explained in the records. Not adoption as we understand it. Adoption requires legal procedures and documentation of the child's original status. This is more like assignment, as if the children needed to be distributed and the households were expected to receive them. Assignment becomes a tool of population management. Within a generation, these children of unknown origin are indistinguishable from children with documented lineage. They inherit property, join guilds, and marry into established families. The lack of genealogical connection does not impede their full participation in society. They are indistinguishable from neighbors with long family records. This suggests that genealogical certainty was not as important as we might assume. Or perhaps it was understood differently. Belonging was created through documentation and acceptance rather than through biological descent. Belonging could be procedural rather than genetic. the implications extend to everyone claiming medieval European ancestry. If populations were supplemented or replaced through undocumented processes in the mid-14th century, then the genealogies connecting modern Europeans to medieval ancestors become uncertain. We might be descended from children of unknown origin rather than from the families we believe we are connected to. Ancestry, in that case, is a more complicated claim. Faith filled the gaps history left. Baptism made people Christian regardless of origin. Church records established identity regardless of genealogy. The institutional framework of medieval Christianity provided a mechanism for integrating populations without explaining where they came from. Faith and record-keeping created social reality. The question persists: if identity could be created through documentation rather than descent, who were these children really? What does that mean for who we are? Who are we descended from, really? The question remains unsettled. Governments, churches, and cities continue operating through the plague years and after, as if uninterrupted. The institutional persistence is remarkable. Administrative structures that should have collapsed instead function with apparent normalcy. Continuity of administration demands explanation. The continuity is not explained by resilience alone. Resilience implies stress, adaptation, visible strain. Medieval institutions show none of that. They show smooth operation, consistent procedures, and bureaucratic routine that persists regardless of the alleged demographic catastrophe surrounding them. Resilience, as usually understood, does not fit the documentary traces. Perhaps they were not rebuilt, only reoccupied. Reoccupation could explain the apparent lack of reconstruction. A cathedral does not need to be reconstructed if the craftsmen who can maintain it are available. An administrative system does not need to be reinvented if the clerks who can operate it are present. A city does not need to be replanned if the population density it was designed for is maintained. The physical fabric and the human skills supporting it matter. The institutions persist because the physical and organizational infrastructure remains intact. What changes is the population inhabiting that infrastructure, operating those institutions, living in those buildings. Institutions endure even when genealogies fracture. This explains why there is no regression, no period of simplified governance or reduced administrative capacity. The systems do not need to be rebuilt from first principles because they are never truly destroyed. They simply continue with new people operating them. The medieval world was not rebuilt after the Black Death, it was inherited. The cities, cathedrals, legal systems, administrative procedures, and craft guilds all existed before and all continued after, regardless of what happened to the specific individuals who originally created them. This reframes how we understand historical continuity. We assume that continuity means the same people or their direct descendants maintaining institutions over time. But institutional continuity can exist even with population replacement, as long as the structures themselves remain and new populations can be integrated into their operation. A stage remains when actors change. The performance continues because the stage, the script, and the theatrical infrastructure persist regardless of who performs. The medieval European world was a stage built, organized, and structured to accommodate different actors. The Black Death might have changed the actors, but the stage remained, and new performers appeared to fill the roles. The question is who managed the transition? Who ensured the stage remained ready, the institutions continued functioning, the cities remained habitable? Who coordinated the integration of new populations into existing structures? What survives a reset? Everything but memory. Accepting this pattern isolates the observer. To see it is to step outside consensus reality and to question fundamental assumptions about historical continuity and identity. The official narrative, provides comfort. Civilizations are resilient, populations recover, history proceeds through comprehensible cause and effect. The pattern suggests discontinuity can be masked by institutional continuity, that populations can be replaced while documentation persists, and that the history we believe in might be a constructed narrative rather than a transparent record. This realization carries cost. Conversations become difficult. Raising these questions invites dismissal or hostility. The evidence is there, documented in archives across Europe, but acknowledging the pattern it reveals means accepting uncertainty about who we are and where we come from. History becomes provisional. The genealogies connecting us to the past become questionable. The continuity we assume between medieval Europe and the modern world becomes uncertain in ways that undermine comfortable narratives about heritage and identity. Identity becomes inherited rather than descended, inherited in the sense of taking on roles and structures created by others, occupying institutions and cities built for different people, claiming lineage that documentation supports but biology might not. The first photograph returns now, the empty street in Florence, catalogued as early morning stillness. But the emptiness means something different after seeing the pattern. It is not absence waiting to be filled by the morning crowd. It is infrastructure awaiting inhabitants, a city built for occupants who might not be the ones we assume. The street looks lived in because it was designed to be. The buildings stand ready because they were meant to receive populations. The shadows are sharp because everything is in place, waiting. Absence becomes the loudest record. The silence in the archives, the gaps in genealogy, and the missing manuscripts all tell a story through what they do not say. What else are we standing inside unaware? The 1357 manuscript is gone. But the streets remain, the buildings remain, the children arrived, the institutions continued, the administrative reset happened, the genealogies fractured and were reconstructed through documentation rather than dissent. And somewhere between loss and continuity, between catastrophe and persistence, between the death rolls and the census registers, history chose a version that felt safer, a version that preserved the illusion of unbroken descent, that explained away the patterns, that filed the contradictions under acceptable headings. The photograph still hangs in the British Library archive. The street still stands empty in sepia-toned silence. The catalogue note still explains it as early morning staging, but the question will not rest. If civilization did not collapse, who was it waiting for?